Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Neal Williams. Dr. Williams is a professor of entomology at the University of California, Davis, specializing in pollination ecology and bee biology. And today he's going to be speaking about assessing bee exposure risk for and potential for habitat-based mitigation in California agriculture. So, Neal, you can go ahead and share your slides.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to join the group and provide the presentation. I hope that people find it useful. And it's also my position is one that I'm working with native bees in terms of pollination and sometimes with other kinds of managed bees too. And then also study bee biology itself. And so my talk today will cover a bit of bee diversity, and then I'll talk a little bit about their life cycles and differences in the way that they go about making a living. I'll talk about some of the role of non-honeybee pollinators in agriculture, what we're sort of seeing ongoing at the moment, and then the majority of it will be about looking at routes of pesticide exposure and a little bit about how we might mitigate that through some particular um, management-based decisions we make, mostly about the use of diversifying habitat in agriculture. Okay, so and I guess questions can be in the chat, and we'll try to answer those as we go. There'll be a couple of polls as we move through things. So again, thanks for joining today. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the diversity. So most of us are familiar with the use of commercial honeybees in pollination across the country, but it's useful to remember when we think about impacts of pesticide and the sorts of decisions we make and the role that bees play, that there is a whole lot more diversity out there. Bees are among the most diverse groups of insects that we see. We have over 3,500 species in North America as a whole. If we zoom in just to look at the state of California itself, within California, we have about 1,600 bee species, give or take. So of the total diversity in the United States, California houses quite a lot of that diversity just here in our state alone. And so there's some really great opportunities with that for use in agriculture, and just in terms of maintaining that diversity is something to be aware of. I want to switch to talk a little bit about bee life cycles and bee biology, mostly as a way to, if you're listening and thinking about some of the things I'll talk about later, a little bit of understanding of how bees essentially make their living in different ways, other than what we're familiar with bees that are social, living in white boxes and trucked around like honeybees. I think it's useful to sort of understand the differences. So the bee life cycle is one that's typical of many other insects that we see. In fact, very similar in a way to that of butterflies. They have a complete metamorphosis. So we're used to seeing adults, like you see this Eucerine bee, a native bee visiting a flower here. But most of the life cycle of bees is actually spent as immatures within the nest, wherever that nest might be. And so bees lay eggs like all insects. And so this top photograph shows an example of a provision made of pollen and nectar, which bees use to feed their offspring, with a nice glistening egg laid right and stuck to the side of it. And the offspring bee will then consume that during its development. The next photo, they go through a series of larvae, like they're not caterpillars, but not unlike a caterpillar that you might be familiar with. Then they spin a cocoon, and this next figure shows a cutaway inside a bee cocoon where the bee is in the middle of pupating, so pupation is there. And that's the metamorphosis stage, where they then are going to emerge from the pupa as an adult. And in this case, we're showing a cutaway. The adult is still within its cocoon, all tucked in there, and it will then chew its way out of the cocoon to emerge as an adult, like the one we'll see that you see in the picture here. So this multi-stage life cycle, the majority of which is spent not as an adult in terms of total time, but is spent as an immature within a nest. And sometimes it's in one place and sometimes in another. So that's sort of the next set of things I'll talk about in a moment. But first, if we think about bees, the other thing in terms of understanding their interaction with the environment, and particularly with pesticides, is understanding where they get their food. So bees are specialized feeders on plant materials, specifically mostly pollen and nectar, where pollen provides protein and lipids, fats that they need, And nectar is providing a variety of amino acids, but primarily carbohydrate, sugar. And so the adults are very sugar dominated themselves. They're foraging a lot on sugar to fuel their own flight. But then they're collecting a lot of pollen and some nectar as well to provision those offspring in that little mass of pollen nectar that you saw in the previous slide. One sort of exciting or interesting thing about bees is that although we think about honeybees as being highly generalized, they visit a lot of different flowers. That's why we can use them for crop pollination. There's actually a whole range of specialization in terms of bees foraging, where some bees are quite specialized, visiting only a couple of species of plants or a few related plants within one group, all the way to those that are more generalized. And so we often see in wild bees, we see a degree of feeding specialization. That has implications for their use as pollinators too, which I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of that nesting, again, this part of the life cycle is really important, where they're immature, where they're eggs and larvae, because bees spend so much time there. And they nest, they build above ground, they occupy existing cavities. And so those are often in hollow tunnels within twigs or soft stems. And the picture you see on the other side of the slide is an artificial set of cavities that have been made, kind of like a condominium for bees, where each one of those holes has been drilled and then lined with a paper straw. And bees will, many of these bees will quite readily accept those kinds of opportunities, and that's what allows us to sort of manage some of the native populations as well. So we often call those twig nesting or stem nesting bees above ground. That contrasts with the greater majority of bees. The most species are actually bees that are excavators. They actually dig their own burrows underground. This shows a cutaway of one particular species where the tunnel goes straight with those different pollen balls that are made of pollen and nectar, and different stages of bee development in a series of brood chambers that the female made and then provisioned and then laid an egg on each one. And so these are sequentially older depending on which brood cell we're looking at in those little chambers. So these are the ground nesting bees, and there's a great diversity of nest types, but this is the general strategy. And then I've just gone over some of the different nesting strategies and getting on towards bees, which are exemplified by bumblebees, which build their nests in larger openings. They're not excavating, but they're nesting in things like abandoned burrows of rodents or pockets in rotted pieces of logs. And these bees, unlike many of the previous examples I showed you, are also social, although they're annual, not perennial. They don't go on year to year like a honeybee, but you'll still see a lot of individuals, all that are related in this social colony, and you can see the offspring in these little cocoons and things as well. So that's a little bit about their differences in life cycle, and I'm only giving you a sort of a taste of that because I think understanding the different ways that they forage, whether they're specialized or much more generalized in the flowers they visit, and whether they're and where they're nesting have important implications for how we think about them and promote them in general, but certainly in terms of how they may be exposed to pesticides and how we try and deal with that. I want to talk a little bit about then the role of these bees in the pollination of crops. Again, we rely as a cornerstone of agricultural pollination on managed honeybees, partly because they're generalized and they do nest in large cavities, which we can make artificial cavities, those white boxes, and move them where we want them to be. But we have found through a variety of research in our own lab and many others that there are other strategies, and I'm always promoting this idea of integrated approaches to pollination, which make use of our existing wild pollinators, as well as certain individual native species or species that are also wild that we also manage to some extent to benefit crop pollination. So I want to briefly talk about that before I shift to talking about pesticides. So why do we use them? Well, why would we bother if we have honeybees Well, one reason is that other species of bees for certain types of flowers and thus particular crops can actually be more efficient at pollinating than the honeybee. The jack of all trades aspect of the honeybee does or can translate into being the master of none. It's not particularly excellent at a lot of things, whereas some of these bees are very specialized, that are specialized, are very good at what they do forage on which flowers they forage. One example is the alfalfa leafcutter bee shown here. And for those who don't know about alfalfa, it's in the pea family, but it has a very particular kind of pollination mechanism, which is called a trip flower. And that is that the anthers and the stigma are in this column. We call it the staminal column. And when a bee visits, it causes the flower to change instantaneously, more or less, its configuration. It trips that column, which transfers pollen onto the bee, and then from the bee onto the stigma of a different flower if the flower is lucky. And you can see a bee that's just tripped a flower here and the spray of pollen that comes flying off as part of that mechanism. The leafcutter bee, because of its size and its behavior, is much more tolerant of getting hit by that trip mechanism, and it's very efficient at tripping the flowers themselves, and a flower must be tripped in order to pollinate. Yeah, so that's one example. Also specialization. This is a picture of Peponapus or Eucera, the native squash bees that I think there was a previous presentation in the series about. Because if a bee is specialized on a particular type of flower and the crop happens to be that type, in this case it'd be squash blossoms, then the visitor is very faithful. And so all of the pollen that it collects and is foraging on is going to be transferred only to squash flowers, because those are really the only kinds of flowers the bee is visiting. And so we have a higher quality of pollen transfer because there's no transfer between different types of flower species. They're very faithful to the crop itself. And that's true of squash bees. It's also true of these folks. These are the sunflower, an example of a sunflower bee. Both the squash bees and the sunflower bees are native to North America, and they're very faithful to their respective crop types or native plants that are related. The other thing that we see is the honeybee also tends to have a very large flight foraging radius. They're very efficient at scouring the broad landscape for resources for nectar and for pollen. Many wild bee species have much shorter foraging ranges, and those shorter foraging ranges can be very useful in agricultural pollination depending on the context. And so this is an example of a seed production field of canola where the grower is interested in just pollinating one variety against another, and they want to avoid the contamination of their seed production from other sorts of canola or other flowers that are nearby. And so they are using alfalfa leafcutter bees, which also will go to canola. And you show a picture of their managed nesting blocks with thousands of bees in this one big structure under the tent. But they forage only a couple of 100 meters from their nest ever. And so there's a less problem of genetic contamination for the seed grower. Finally, another reason to think about integrating a combination of wild bees or promoting wild bees in addition to honeybees has to do with synergies. And that is that the presence of wild bees can actually improve the pollination efficacy, the effectiveness of the honeybees themselves. So we're not trying to replace them, but we're trying to make every visit by a honeybee count just a little bit more. And so there's good data from almond from our lab, and also on sunflowers from mine and colleagues' work some years ago, that the presence of wild bees increases efficiency of seed production. This is for sunflower down in Yolo County. And so on the bottom axis, you see this is increasing numbers of wild bees per meter of crop field, and increasing on the one side, and increasing diversity, numbers of types of species groups on the crop field. And then the honeybee pollination efficiency, the number of seeds produced on that seed head per visit of a honeybee. And you see there's a very strong positive relationship with both the abundance and the diversity of wild species, even though all that's being measured here is the efficacy of pollination by honeybees themselves. The other way that we see the value of a more integrated approach is this idea of complementarity. So we see that it's just the way we use complementarity or to complement something. One thing is a little bit one way of doing it versus another way of doing it. Together, they complement each other and make the overall outcome better. This is very true when we look at the way that honeybees visit flowers and versus other bees visit flowers. And one example is for strawberry production. So what we're after with strawberries, and these are the pollination dependent strawberries, less than the large everbearing types. We want berries that are fully inflated, where all of the fruit is formed. We don't want those two to the right-hand side where either the tip is not properly pollinated or some side of the base is not, and we get misshapen fruit that are not marketable. If we look at the bottom diagrams, this shows the movement of different bees around a strawberry blossom. In panel B, that's the one here, we see what honeybees tend to do. They're large. They move over the top of the blossom back and forth and pollinate the stigmas at the top of the flower. Smaller bees that are wild bees often land on the flower and sort of circumnavigate. They kind of walk all around the base of the flower and pollinate at the base. And together, this leads to a higher proportion of berries which are fully, properly filled and marketable with larger berry size and better shape. So again, it's this complementarity of the way they visit that together provides a benefit of integrating wild bees in pollination. So finally, what is being used? What's the current use of wild bees? So I want to talk about a series of bees that are currently managed. One of the main crops in which we use managed non-honeybee bees is alfalfa production, not so much in California, but to the north. We use the alfalfa leafcutter bee, Megachile rotundata, and the alkali bee, Nomia melanderi. And they are just, again, very efficient at pollinating. One of them is a bee that nests above ground, the leafcutter bee, and one a bee that nests in the soil, the alkali bee. Together, these are managed in large areas for pollination of alfalfa. Leafcutter bees' nests look like little cigars made out of leaf material. And this is a series of little brood cells that are all where the leaves are nicely formed. And I'm showing you an X-ray in the bottom part of this panel looking inside that nest at all the larvae bee that are developing within those little cells. If we look at the way that they're managed in the field, this shows a grower, and she's got a tent with hundreds, if not thousands, of nest holes in these boards here, and in a field that's about to come into bloom for alfalfa. The alkali bee nests in the ground in soil. This shows the top of the nest in very high densities with one nest almost on top of the next one. And they're managed in large areas around alfalfa fields. And you see these white areas indicated by the arrows, which are beds of bees that are managed by growers at high densities for the alkali bee. And again, this is something we see up in Oregon, Western Washington, Idaho. So why the need for integrating? Well, we really need to get pollination done, often in contexts where there's a high demand. So flowers are highly dense. Alfalfa, I estimate, it's about 120 million flowers per acre, if not more. And they're all opening in very short sequence in time. And so lots of demand for pollination. Same is true for sunflower, large acreages, lots of flowers that need to get pollinated. So adding these bees that can increase efficiency and numbers is very, very useful. Often there's a need for very specific behavior. Again, these specialized bees that stay on the field. In California, we have a lot of hybrid seed production where we need transfer of pollen from male rows to female rows. And those specialists are going to stay put and be visiting these flowers and getting the cross-pollination that we need. The other uses in cases where flowers are largely unattractive to honeybees. And one great example, again, from this region and up in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, is going to be pollination of onion or carrot, neither of which is very attractive to honeybees. And as a result, the stocking densities are incredibly high, at least 16 hives per acre. And so the cost of that can be pretty large for the grower. So alternative bees that like onion or visit it can be very useful. In each case that I've shown you, there are managed native bees or wild bees that can help with this process. Okay, so we'll move on. So that ends the part of the presentation that's really about bee biology and bees as pollinators, and I want to focus for the rest of the time on pesticide challenges. So I highlighted the idea that like bees have there's a lot of diversity out there, there's a lot of potential, and we have high demand for pollination in a lot of our agricultural areas on various crops. Those same agricultural areas, though, present real challenges for bees, or they can, depending on management, because as part of our best management practice, we're using a variety of different pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides to try and manage other kinds of issues that we have with production. And then we have unintended consequences for these beneficial insects like pollinators. And so trying to understand, well, given that this is the way that we are going about our agriculture production, how can we at least try and mitigate or help with some of those problems? And how is it that the problems arise in the first place? So I want to talk about that. So pesticides are pretty well established as an important driver of bee declines that we see in different regions. And so how might we counteract them? I want to talk about, first of all, just go through classes and routes of action that can affect the exposure patterns that we see, talk about some of the non-target effects that pesticides have on bees, and what is the extent and exposure and impact that we tend to see, and then talk about a specific example of an action that we could use to counteract exposure. Obviously, the elephant in the room that I won't talk about is how do we effectively just reduce overall amount of application and still achieve the benefits that we're after for the primary use of pest management. Okay, so classes of pesticides, I'll go through this quickly, and if you're a pest control advisor or other professional who does this every day, you can just snooze for a little bit. So we are looking at herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. And in terms of impacts on bees, herbicides in general are not particularly of the highest toxicity. I mean, they can be toxic, but mostly what their action is that by applying them in ways to manage weeds, they're reducing the availability of flowering plants that bees might rely on at other times when the crop isn't flowering. So this overly, what I would say from a bee's perspective, overly clean way of managing fields. They also can remove host plants if we're thinking about caterpillars or butterflies, which can be pollinators of general importance more broadly, although not particularly crop important pollinators. In the case of fungicides, the effect is also what I'd call relatively indirect. Fungicides I'll talk about a direct effect in a moment, but they tend to, rather than harming the insect directly physiologically, they can have indirect effects through operating on impacting insect microbiomes. We increasingly know, just for humans, the gut microbiome of bees and other insects is tremendously important for their normal functioning, yeasts and bacteria that are part of their microbiome, internal microbiome. And there's a whole microbiome within the pollen provisions that bees collect for their offspring that is also modifying and augmenting the food that they're eating. You can think about like how bread is better than just flour for us. So obviously applying fungicides is going to impact the microbiome by killing some of those microbes and is known to have detrimental effects. We also see that fungicides, some of them seem to have interactive effects with insecticides that make the insecticides more toxic to bees. And so this is showing dosing, low, medium, and high dosing along the x-axis from left to right, and the toxicity impact on bees, looking at a combination of neonicotinoids and neonicotinoid systemic insecticides with a variety of different fungicides. And so you see in the blue, fungicides by themselves, low toxicity, insecticides much more toxic, and sometimes in combination, even more toxic, double the toxic impact that we have, and certainly increasing with the dose overall. Insecticides, of course, are our biggest, among our biggest concerns because they are designed to kill insects. And so as insects themselves, right, bees can be affected through direct effects on mortality, reductions in what I call fecundity, that's the number of offspring they produce. So they can have problems with managed bees, with keeping those colonies going, as well as with wild bee populations, and then sublethal effects, which don't outright kill the bees, but lower their ability to do pollination in the ways we'd like, as well as in their ability to provision their own offspring. So that's a little bit about the types. Exposure that we expect for pollinators, also the routes of exposure are going to depend on the way that pesticides are applied, which is this sort of interaction between the type of chemical, systemic versus non-systemic pesticides, and how they're applied. So many pesticides are applied topically by sprays or things like sprays, where they're directly sprayed to foliage, or in some cases sprayed on the ground. In the case of caterpillars that are out feeding like butterflies, we can see direct contact. That's also true of adult bees that are out foraging. And that can be also through secondary compound with residues that are remaining on leaves after the pesticide has been sprayed. We also then see those residues leading to ingestion rather than contact exposure, where the bees are then eating it or getting it into them from other routes, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we also, in addition to topical application of pesticides, we have systemics. Those are applied to the plant or to the soil, and also very commonly through seed treatments that indirectly come through the soil and are taken up by the plant. And rather than being residues on the surfaces of plants, those are then translocated through vascular tissue of the plants and end up in all different tissues of the plant itself. Largely, that is then affecting insects through ingesting the plant along with plant tissue itself. And if you think about non-target effect on bees, they're not eating leaves, but pollen and nectar, sort of nectar, those are also tissue-like things, right, that the bees are consuming. They were certainly produced through or by the plant. And so if it's a systemic pesticide, they're often contaminated with the systemic compound. Routes of exposure can vary. Those ones that I went over by insect pollinator group, where butterflies can be feeding directly on flowers as adults for nectar use, and foliage feeding through larvae feeding on leaf tissues. Bees are a little bit different. Adults do basically all of the foraging, right? They're going out and collecting food for the offspring, but they're collecting pollen and nectar. They're also potentially coming into contact with contaminating materials that they're collecting for the nest. You can think about those leaf cutter bees that are bringing leaf material back, or other soil or that. In some cases, like the honeybee, bees are actually using water for cooling the nest, and so contaminated water is an issue. From the standpoint of the larvae, they are stuck in the nest. They must feed on whatever is brought back to them. The nest might be above or below ground. If it's in the soil, it's possible that there's contamination through the soil. And whatever food is being brought back, if the pollen and nectar is contaminated, it might be getting to the larvae through ingestion at that stage. So I just want to go back over and highlight again, I think, just give people another thing looking at routes of exposure. So if we're looking at bees, routes of exposure, this is adult exposure and ingestion, and I'll just highlight the routes of exposure. So if we're looking at a topical pesticide application right here, it's applied to leaf material, in this case, maybe a tree, and it's on those surfaces. It might be sprayed, it might be hitting bees directly, so we'd have a direct impact on a foraging adult. It might also be directly applied through and land on flowers if they were open at the wrong time, even through drift or something. And then it would be on pollen and in nectar that the bees are taking back to feed to the offspring in the nest, right? And likewise, if the leaf material that a bee is bringing back to build the nest is contaminated, they could be getting it that way. Systemic pesticides down below, that's going to be applied as a soil drench, or it might be applied as a seed treatment, not in the case of almond, but in some annual crop. It's then translocating throughout the plant tissues And here we would then see it ending up in the sorts of flower parts that bees are then contacting, in particular pollen and nectar, again, which they're taking back to feed to the larvae. And so this just shows some examples, right? And so we can see also possibly, depending on what the nest is made out of, here's a nest where those partitions between cells, so this is pollen of a species that has purple pollen, and between it there's mud, and those mud provisions between, if the soil is contaminated, there could be pesticide in there as well. So bees could come into contact with it that way. Okay, so how big a deal is this? So if we look at direct impacts of pesticide mortality, impacts of reduced reproduction, we see in the case of, this is an example from canola where the seeds were treated, nothing else was treated. It's a seed coating treatment with a systemic insecticide. And we see for wild bees, the density of wild bees on fields where the seed was treated versus control fields were not. There was a significant decrease in wild bee numbers. In the case of the actual nesting activity, we saw an almost complete shutdown of nesting activity by this foraging bee here in fields that had the seed coat treatment as opposed to controls. And then even in the case of these social bees and bumblebees, we see that the number of cocoons in seeds that are in seed treated fields is significantly lower compared to in the control fields. So all of these different ways that we see decreases in mortality and in reproduction. When we look at contaminated food, insecticides can affect that food and the outcomes quite a long time after it's applied. So even though insecticides are applied according to label, they might end up in the flower resources. This is some work we did at UC Davis. Looking at the total number of surviving offspring, that's up and down on the axis here, under cases where resource availability was low versus high. And one thing you see here with insecticides or not is that when you have more resources, there are more bees. But when you have insecticides combined with resource levels, it doesn't really matter. In both cases where they're insecticides, we have reduced total surviving offspring as a result of pesticides that were applied way, way before bloom, like a month before bloom, but they're systemic and they end up in the pollen and nectar that the bees are feeding to their offspring. Another example of the way we might get exposure is through contaminated soil for those bees that are nesting in the ground. And this is this squash bee again. The pesticide can move from the soil. The bee's provision is sitting in that soil and the bees all around it. And it can translocate from soil up into the provision, and then the larva is consuming it, or the larva is in contact with the soil in the ground underneath, and so it can come in contact with it that way. And so these slides don't really matter. I think they just reemphasize the number of nests in areas that are using this pesticide versus the control fields is significantly lower. And the number of offsprings coming out of each individual nest or coming out of these areas is also lower when in these different treatments that use the pesticide drench in the soil as compared to control fields. Moving on finally, so that's about mortality and reproduction. Sublethal effects mostly have been done at things looking at trials in the lab where we're feeding bees on laced nectar or artificial nectar and looking at their outcomes. But there have been some really great work on open field trials, and what we basically see is that bees that are exposed to certain insecticides, we see in general what we would characterize as hyperactivity, longer foraging trips and more of them, but much less efficient foraging, fewer pollen foraging trips, and much less food collected and brought back to the nest in a given amount of time. We also see that bees appear much less able to manipulate flowers. And this is a graph showing the number of bees successfully pollinating flowers, with it increases from bottom to top with days since treatment. And basically what you're seeing here is increasing concentration of pesticides applied on the field that they're foraging on leads to a much lower successful pollination rate. So it's not killing the bees, but it's making them much less able to successfully achieve this pollinating behavior. Okay, as we move from individual sort of effects on and tests to thinking about it, the landscape, I want to remind us that at the landscape context, bees, of course, are highly mobile, and they integrate pesticide exposure across vast landscapes, many different fields, many different habitats from multiple sources, and that they're largely or quite often going to be exposed to multiple types of compound together. So there's mixtures of the type that we could be concerned about, for example, with the fungicide and the insecticide together. So I want to tell you about an example from California that just shows you what it can look like. So the traces of spaghetti lines over on the left are showing the accumulation of loaded pesticide across this 3-county region in Yolokalusa and Solano County, with some primary pesticides that we tested for. And so this is just looking at, from the public database that we have, what does the pattern of pesticide use look like? Here are the different crop fields, and at the edge, this is an animation of how just one pesticide, well, different pesticides are accumulating in different places over time. And so over the season, we just see more and more use across the counties. So there's a lot of pesticide being applied out there. And so there's considerable potential for exposure to these bees. Another example, again, looking at the Central Valley in general, and looking at how widespread pesticides are. This is a really interesting study, not from my group, but looking at milkweed in the Central Valley, and which is the primary host of Western monarchs. The caterpillar feed on that. This is looking across 19 sites and 220 plant samples. These samples are from agriculture areas, from refuges areas, so wildlife refuges, not agricultural areas, and also from urban landscapes. And all of those samples, all 227 plant samples, had pesticides, even those that were sampled from wildlife refuges. So there is pesticide that is out there moving across the environment. So understanding risk is quite important. So where does that come from? One thing we can try and do is identify, well, what kinds of pollens are actually the source? And we might be tempted to think, ooh, it is growers that are a problem. It's the pollen that the bees are collecting on those fields. Even though pesticides might be applied on fields, that's not necessarily where the contaminated pollen comes from. This is an example from Michigan blueberry. The bar component that's in blue is the percent contribution to total toxic load that comes from blueberry pollen, and the gray is the part that's coming from everything else. And so what you see is the majority of the toxicity is coming from chemicals that were not applied to blueberry at all. They're not registered for application of blueberry, so they're coming from somewhere else. And the idea here is just that bees are very mobile, and they're getting pesticides, or they can get pesticide exposure from a wide variety of locations, not just the field on which the bees are sitting. So we can then approach trying to understand those from sort of a landscape perspective. And how do we do that? So if we think about the ways bees are foraging, again, you'll have a bee that's at a particular nesting location in the environment. There'll be flowers in different places that I'm circling here. Some of them crops, some of them non-crops. Bees are flying to forage on flowers from many different locations. The movement of those bees and how far they're going is largely based on things like their body size. So smaller bees, like some of these solitary bees, foraging close, bigger bees foraging much more broadly. And so integrating and being exposed potentially from a much wider area. And they're bringing back resources from those to the hive. Some of those areas will have pesticides applied to them, and will have pesticide residues on foliage or in flowers. And then the bees have the potential to be bringing that back in with the food that they're foraging for, and as part of their job as pollinators. So I will also point out that other traits that I've talked about can affect exposure. We talked about specialists being really important and really good because they are closely associated with a crop if they're a specialist on that type of plant. That also means that there's a higher probability of exposure if that crop is a pesticide applied to it, because that's what the bee is visiting, and that's only what the bee is visiting. So let me finish up really quickly, just talking about like how one way we might mitigate that pesticide effect. So we've been working with, and others too, the idea if we're planting flowers or we're trying to promote flowering landscapes to support the nutrition of bees, what's the evidence that doing that might also provide a way to mitigate pesticide exposure? The idea that if we have flowers out there that are not directly sprayed, is that clean forage of benefit to bees? The alternative would be that it's something called an ecological trap, where essentially an ecological trap is we're essentially attracting organisms to that, like bees like to go to flowers. And then for some reason, that habitat, like the flowers, is risky or it kills the bees while they're there. And that would be like, oh, that's because we sprayed pesticides accidentally or through drift on the flowers. And so we sort of asked the bees to forage on the flowers we put out there, and then we killed them by spraying them. That would be bad. And so the outcome of a trap would be lower survival and population, possible extinction. We'd like to avoid that, obviously. And so these studies were done, again, right here in Neal County in association with almond orchards, where we either had sort of control sites with no flowering vegetation planted, just resident vegetation, or ones where we augmented the landscapes with flowers. We set out nests for wild solitary bees and put out nests for bumblebees that had foraging bumblebees. And then essentially what we did was to collect, we recorded how many offspring were produced in the nest, and we collected pollen, mostly to see what were they collecting, identifying it, but then also measuring the residues of pesticide in the pollen they were collecting. So real quickly, what do we find? We find that both bee species forage from pollen that from the flowers we provided. So planting wildflowers, we confirm, not the point of this study, but we confirm that it is a good thing. In the case of the osmia, which has a short foraging distance, most of the pollen came from the wildflower plantings. In the case of the bumblebees, much larger, wider foraging. They were collecting pollen across the landscape, but still relied about a third of the pollen coming from us augmenting it. In terms of supporting reproduction, osmia nests, osmia were 6 times more likely to nest if they were at a site that had wildflowers versus one that did not. And in terms of pesticide risk, what we find is that pesticide risk is high. We find high residues on the pollen that they're collecting, most of it from the wildflowers. So yes, they are being exposed, but in fact, it does not create an ecological trap. They are still nesting much more likely as a result. So the net benefit, despite some pesticide exposure, is good. All right. So the net benefit is good. Wildflowers are good, even if there is a bit of a risk. Okay. The benefits of the resource outweigh the pesticide risk. In the case of bumblebees, we see the same. We've seen more production of queen bumblebees in the nest in sites with wildflower plantings, over 250% higher at sites with wildflowers. And this complicated graph here, I'll just say really quickly, is that we see the greatest benefit of wildflowers and a significantly greater benefit at areas where the pesticide risk in the landscape is highest. So the wildflowers planting does, in fact, for bumblebees, mitigate exposure, even though those bees are collecting resources and contacting pesticides from broadly in the landscape. The presence of this cleaner forage or the augmented forage from the wildflower plantings is overall a net benefit. So the take homes from this part, bees do use pollen from plantings, so they were increasing their nutrition. We see increased reproduction. And when pesticide risk is high, that's especially when we see the benefit of reducing the impact or outweighing the risk by planting the wildflowers. So I'm going to stop there. And I'd be happy to take a few questions if people have them. And then I think the hosts are going to read questions that might be coming from the chat or something.
Yes,
But
thank
thanks
you.
everybody for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really great. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, and yeah, I'll see how many we can get to. So the first question, is there any concern for using biological pesticide for bee health?
For using biological pesticides, or you mean pesticides that are not, or they're not inorganic or synthetic pesticides? Is that how I'm reading that question?
That's how I would read it. Yeah, for using biological pesticide.
Certainly much softer chemicals. And if we're talking about things like BT, like Bacillus thuringiensis, toxins, those are quite species specific. So there's a much lower risk. So I'd say overall, much reduced risk. As you can imagine, most of the research is done on things that are relatively toxic as a first pass. And I think now we're sort of getting to try and understand some of these other impacts, but much lower, much lower. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then what is the most detrimental insecticide ingredient encountered?
Oh, it's going to depend on where the bees are foraging. But you're saying like which pesticide has the highest individual per bee toxicity? Um, boy, like I think that's a question that's better to punt on because toxicity or impact is a function of per unit level of toxicity, right? An LD50 value plus the amount that is applied in a particular case. So one of the things in our research we're doing and why we're doing it is modeling the overall toxic load across whole landscapes because it's highly variable, right? It really depends. There are some fields of the same crop where it'll be lower because of patterns of application, and others where it'll be lower because we are using different chemicals which are less toxic. So
Okay, thank you. What about the impact of tillage practices on ground nesting species? Have there been studies with some of the threatened bumblebees regarding nesting depth?
oh yeah. So definitely studies on ground nesting bees, and that tillage depth can definitely matters. There's work from my lab group on squash bees, for sure, and depends on tillage depth. With bumblebees themselves, not that I'm aware of. So bumblebees do nest in crop fields, but their tendency to do so is, I think, more limited. And so there hasn't been, that I'm aware of, any study that's looked at impact of tillage on threatened bumblebees, you're saying like Bombus crotchii or others that we're particularly concerned about. So not at this time that I'm aware of. It's a great question. I'll take one more if you have a good one, then I gotta head out.
The increase in pesticide survival, queen production, etc., in areas with supplemental wildflower forage reminds me, maybe this is just a comment, reminds me of studies into honeybee nutrition supplementation versus pesticide exposure survival.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And again, we've done this for bumblebees and done it for other bees. Like there's definitely there can be benefits of better nutrition just in terms of bees making it through. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just do one more here. Okay, so this is about bee boxes. Why is the straw used in bee boxes? Is it necessary?
No, it's not. It can help with sanitation. So some of the pathogens that bees get that are fungal disease and other things, by lining them, it's a way to keep them clean. But most commercial operations that are non-apis beekeepers do not use those straws. We use them for our purposes. We can manipulate the nests and do crazy fun things with them experimentally. But they would use other methods where they can remove the bees much more easily and then sterilize the nesting material with flame sterilization or maybe some chemical in between years to be able to reuse the nesting material. It's a great question. Yeah. So no, not needed. It's helpful, but not needed.
Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you so much for your presentation today. Thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you taking that time to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks everybody. I mean, that's what we're here for. So happy to help.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Bye for now then.
Bye.